The path toward self-mastery is rarely paved with grand gestures. It begins quietly, in the mundane moments of everyday life. We assume that true wisdom requires dramatic revelation or profound suffering. But Seneca teaches us to look instead at the small flickers of irritation, the whispered offenses of ordinary interactions. Our initial point of friction often arises from carelessness, a misplaced word from a loved one, an unnecessary criticism from a colleague, the sudden failure of a plan we had carefully laid out. These moments are not accidents, they are training grounds for the soul. They present us with a choice that is immediate and deeply visceral. When these triggers fire, what happens to us? There is an almost physical jolt, a heat rising in the chest, a sudden tightening of the jaw, an instant demand to retaliate. Our primal self screams for justice, or perhaps simply for release. We are wired for reaction. Our culture and immediate emotions teach us that to feel is to be seen, and to react sharply is to prove our vitality. This urge, this lightning-fast response, feels necessary, vital even. It promises the instant resolution of discomfort. But Seneca forces us to pause at this precipice. He asks us to recognize that what we call reaction is often merely a habit, a deeply ingrained neurological pathway that connects stimulus straight to impulse, bypassing the careful consideration of reason. When we lose ourselves in the immediacy of feeling angry, we become enslaved by our emotions. We mistake emotional heat for clarity of thought. The raw power of anger feels like truth. It seems necessary to defend the perceived boundaries that have been violated. Yet, the philosophy challenges this assumption. It posits that the experience itself is not suffering. Rather, the struggle lies in the interpretation, in deciding how much weight we assign to a careless remark or an unexpected disappointment. The trigger merely flickers. It contains no intrinsic malice, only potential energy waiting for us to apply our own will to it. The journey into self-control begins with acknowledging this initial spark, the whisper of the trigger. We must learn to recognize that internal physical warning sign, the flush of blood, the sudden rapid pulse, the tightness in the throat. These are not signs of external danger. They are signals that our internal system is under attack by a perceived injustice. Our first act of mastery is simply noticing. To be aware enough to say, wait, that happened. We must mentally intercept the impulse before it gains momentum and directs us into action we will surely regret later. This moment of interception, this deliberate pause between what happens to us and how we choose to respond, is where all freedom resides. It is the gap between stimulus and response. And in that minuscule sliver of time, wisdom waits. Anger, it is a fire that flares suddenly and fiercely, demanding immediate fuel and instant release. We are taught from childhood to see it as an unavoidable force, a natural response to injustice or insult. But Seneca guides us toward looking past the surface heat, seeing what anger truly is at its core. He asks us not just to manage it, but to understand its nature entirely. To treat it like a foreign entity, something external that we must observe before we let ourselves be consumed by it. Think of anger less as an emotion, and more as a highly charged signal. It is the body's alarm system flashing red when a boundary has been violated, or when something fundamentally unexpected occurs in our life. This signal itself is not suffering. Suffering comes from what we do with it. If we treat this internal flare-up merely as proof of how mad we are, we give anger immense power over our lives. Our goal, then, must be to strip that power away by understanding its true root cause. The raw feeling of anger, that tightening in the chest, the rapid pulse, the sudden flush of blood, is simply a signpost pointing toward something deeper. Seneca suggests that this energy is merely misdirected life force. It is vital energy trapped and distorted by our perception. For instance, if we feel rage because a friend was late, the anger does not spring from the tardiness itself. Rather, it stems from the disappointment with the delay, or perhaps the deep-seated belief that we should always be acknowledged and prioritized. This shift in perspective is monumental. We must learn to ask ourselves, what boundary feels crossed? What expectation was unmet? What value of mine, my time, my peace, my respect, do I feel has been violated here? By identifying the source signal, we begin to untangle the emotional knot. Anger becomes a language, not a master. It speaks volumes about our needs and our vulnerabilities, demands that we simply learn how to listen without responding immediately. The difficulty lies in the moment of intense feeling. In that critical flashpoint, reason is often drowned out by instinct. The immediate impulse suggests confrontation, defense, or withdrawal. But Seneca insists that wisdom requires us to pause long enough to become internal investigators. We must treat our own powerful emotions with the same cool scrutiny we would apply to a stranger's dramatic tale. If we observe anger scientifically, we begin to see its patterns. Does it erupt only when we feel powerless? Does it appear whenever someone challenges our self-image? By mapping these consistent triggers, these internal fault lines, we are not merely surviving outbursts, we are building an intellectual map of our own emotional landscape. This knowledge, this detached understanding, is the beginning of freedom. We learn that truly angry people often equate anger with righteousness. They believe their rage proves the absolute truth of their grievance and the moral failing of the other person. Seneca gently dismantles this conceit. He reminds us that righteousness cannot be forced or proven through volatile emotion. It must be demonstrated by calm, rational action. Consider the argument we might have had in our minds just yesterday. We felt wronged, deeply betrayed perhaps. The energy was enormous, promising a fight to the bitter end. But when we step back and view that memory not as a lived experience, but as an object under glass, something foreign and untouchable, it loses its heat. It becomes merely narrative. The core skill Seneca teaches is separation. We must separate the event from our judgment of the event, the fact itself. The careless word, the missed deadline, the broken promise is neutral. It is a mere occurrence in time and space. Our interpretation, the story we tell ourselves about that occurrence, is what activates the emotional circuit. And it is this story, this narrative bias rooted in expectation or hurt, that fuels the coiled serpent of anger. Understanding anger requires bravery. It means facing uncomfortable truths about ourselves. Perhaps our greatest frustration comes not from external injustice, but from our own inability to tolerate discomfort, our desperate need for things to always be orderly and predictable. To acknowledge this self-betrayal is the necessary precursor to true calm. The work of identifying anger, therefore, is a grueling process of deep self-excavation, a search not for villains outside us, but for those vulnerable expectations and rigid judgments within our own minds. This careful observation is the only true sanctuary against emotional slavery, the immediate rush of heat, that familiar tightening in the chest that warns us we are about to lose control. This is the point where impulse screams, demanding an instant, sharp reply. We want the words out, the tension released immediately, no matter the cost of saying them. But Seneca reminds us that between feeling and acting there exists a vast, unwritten space. That space is not emptiness, it is our freedom. It is the breath we take before speaking, the moment we hesitate just long enough for the immediate urgency to fade into mere awareness. We practice this suspension. We learn to count, not as a childish game, but as a deliberate act of resistance against the flow of adrenaline. Count 1, not yet. Breathe deeply and feel the counting anchor you in your body. Count 2. The rising tide of anger begins to meet a steady hand. Count 3. You are noticing the physical signs, the jaw clenching, the quickening heart rate, the flush on the cheeks. These sensations are not proof that you must react. They are merely data points. They are signals demanding your attention. The count continues, turning a simple mental exercise into an architectural process of self-restraint. With each number spoken in your mind, 4, 5, 6, you create microscopic space around the initial trigger. This pause is artificial, yet utterly vital. It forces you to switch from a primitive fight or flight response mechanism to something slower, more reasoned, and infinitely more powerful: contemplation. You are not merely delaying. You are building an intellectual bridge over an emotional gorge. Think of anger as momentum. If left unchecked, it carries us forward relentlessly, a destructive force guided only by heat and immediate grievance. The pause acts like a sophisticated brake system. It allows the initial ferocity to dissipate its steam, changing high-octane rage into mere thoughtful irritation. In that quiet space, something essential begins to unfold: clarity. Clarity reveals what was truly triggered. Was it just the careless word, or was it the pattern of disrespect woven over weeks? Sometimes, Seneca advises, we are not angry at the other person. We are angry at our own expectations of how they should behave. This deliberate delay gives you a chance to reevaluate your moral ground. You ask yourself, is this reaction worthy of my dignity? Will responding in anger actually solve the core problem, or will it merely escalate the noise and deepen the wound? The pause is therefore not inaction. It is highly focused, preparatory action. It is choosing wisdom over volume. It is selecting deliberation over defiance. We must understand that this internal counting process is a mastery of time itself, the ability to negotiate with moments. We are teaching ourselves that we are not slaves to the immediate moment. The instant insult, the frustrating delay, the perceived slight from a colleague, these events happen regardless of our will. But how we allocate our attention, how we choose the interval between them and our response, that remains entirely ours. It is a gift of sovereignty. The challenge is consistency. On the first try, it feels unnatural. The urge to shout, to lash out, remains loud, hot, and demanding. The impulse shouts, count 3, count 5, but persistence builds muscle memory for the mind. Eventually, counting becomes less about numbers and more about the conscious feeling of breath expansion. It is the internal acknowledgement. I feel the heat, yes. I recognize the unfairness, yes, but I will not let this physical wave dictate my next action. I choose to wait for the tide to recede a little further, giving me enough ground to stand on solid philosophical earth. This disciplined pause changes everything about the power dynamic in conflict. Before, we entered an argument already compromised, driven by raw emotion. Now, by taking those critical seconds, we enter it from a position of strength, the strength of self-possession. We become our own truest advocates, masters of our internal landscape. The greatest victory is not winning the argument. It is managing ourselves within it. It is reclaiming the moments that once felt utterly stolen by reflex. This practice trains us to observe ourselves as impartial philosophers observing a difficult drama unfold around us. We see the flare-up in anger, we name it. We say, there is the urgency of offense. And then we breathe, counting silently, letting the noise pass through us without lodging itself within our own spirit. The slow count becomes a meditative ritual that reaffirms one profound truth. Controlling your reaction means you are choosing who you want to be in that moment, a master or merely a victim of circumstance. We have learned to pause. We have found that the mere breath taken before speaking can be a monumental act of resistance. But sometimes, anger is not triggered by a single word or deed. Often, it rises from a deeper current, from the quiet failure of our expectations. This chapter asks us to look at where those currents flow, into the vast and often dangerous territory of anticipation. We live lives dictated by what we believe should happen. We anticipate pleasure when we are with loved ones, perfect efficiency when we leave the house, and validation when we share a thought. And when reality fails to measure up to that vivid internal sketch, when the coffee shop is crowded, or the conversation stalls, or the outcome of an endeavor is merely average, the result is not disappointment alone. The result is a sharp, hot sting, often disguised as fury. The pain we feel when expectation collapses is so profound that our minds sometimes mistake it for betrayal. We feel cheated by life itself. Our initial reaction is to locate the source of the problem outside ourselves. Someone else's poor performance, the circumstance's inherent flaw, or even fate's cold indifference. This makes us reactive, making us prone to lashing out at anything that breaks our pre-built narrative. Seneca directs our attention inward, forcing us to look past the immediate sting and ask a difficult question. Are we angry because what happened was wrong? Or are we angry because it did not match the grand vision we had already painted in our minds? The architecture of anticipation is complex. It requires us to become architects ourselves, to map out our internal assumptions so they do not control our external reactions. The struggle here is intellectual. We must maintain a steady, reasoned gaze on our own internal processes while dealing with the messy unpredictability of the outside world. We spend so much time building ideal scenarios in our heads that when life inevitably scatters those perfect blueprints, we feel robbed. This robbery feels personal and warrants an angry response. The path forward requires us to approach our expectations not as sacred truths, but as hypotheses, as things that can be questioned, revised, and perhaps discarded entirely. We must begin treating them like elaborate theater productions, wonderful when they run smoothly, yet ultimately meaningless once the curtain falls on anything less than perfection. Imagine a grand play in your head. You meticulously plot every scene, every line, anticipating the perfect dramatic payoff. When the actual performance deviates, when an actor forgets their lines, or the lighting is dull, or the subplot simply fails to materialize, your initial reaction is not measured critique. It is often volcanic outrage against the stage itself. Philosophy teaches us that we must become less invested in the perfection of the performance and more focused on the quality of our own viewing experience. We cannot control what others say, nor can we mandate how a given situation unfolds. To try to do so is to stake our inner peace upon external contingency, a foundation built for inevitable failure. The shift in perspective is profound. It means recognizing that expectation itself is a fragile emotion. It is not a stable understanding of reality. When we accept the unpredictable nature of human interaction, when we allow ourselves to believe that good enough is sometimes precisely what is required, a deep and unsettling calmness settles over us. We are learning that dissatisfaction often springs from an inability to forgive life for its beautiful, magnificent imperfections. This journey asks us to actively dismantle our internal scripts. We must question the urgent need for resolution, the automatic belief that every interaction must yield a satisfying climax. Instead, we practice accepting the pause, the unresolved moment, the muted conversation, the delay that serves no clear dramatic purpose. These moments of stillness are not failures. They are freedom. The goal is to decouple our sense of personal worth and tranquility from the successful execution of external narratives. When we realize that life does not owe us a perfect plot arc, when we accept the messy, unscripted nature of day-to-day existence, we rob anger of its most powerful fuel, the perceived injustice of an imperfect reality. We have journeyed a long way together. We learned that the initial flash of anger is not necessarily an evil force. It is often simply a signal, a warning from the deepest parts of ourselves, telling us that something has been challenged, that our boundaries have felt inadequate or perhaps misunderstood. Throughout these lessons, we found tools to create space. The deliberate pause, the questioning of rigid expectations, and the realization that many emotional explosions are fueled by assumptions about how life should play out. Now, we approach a practice Seneca called Premeditatio Malorum. Translating literally, it means imagining the bad things. It is an art form, a mental discipline that sounds stark and perhaps counterintuitive at first. To deliberately dwell on loss, failure, or humiliation. But its purpose is not to invite despair. Rather, it is to strip away the sheer shock value of suffering when it finally arrives. The unprepared mind reacts violently to true adversity. The blow lands with maximum force because we never allowed ourselves to rehearse the impact. We expect life to be consistent and kind, so when reality deviates, the emotional fallout feels catastrophic, a monumental disaster requiring an equally monumental reaction. Seneca teaches us that our fears are often more potent than the actual dangers themselves. We build elaborate mental fortresses around fragile concepts, our reputation, our savings, the affection of others. And until we confront these phantoms, they remain utterly invincible in our minds. The practice begins by calmly calling up potential disasters. Imagine losing everything you own. Not just a financial loss, but the core trappings of your life, the security, the comfort, the belief that things will always work out. Sit with that thought. Allow yourself to feel the initial pang of fear, the tightness in the chest. Now stay there for a beat longer. Do not fight the imagined grief. Instead, observe it. Observe the way your mind spirals into worst-case scenarios, the endless what-ifs and buts. Acknowledge this panicked mental storytelling, recognizing it simply as an intellectual activity, like reading a novel of disaster that you did not write. What remains when you have visualized total loss? Do you truly cease to be yourself? Does your capacity for wisdom vanish? Does the ability to breathe or reason disappear entirely? The answers, illuminated by this strange form of contemplation, are almost always no. You find a core resilience deep within that is far stronger than the scaffolding built around your perceived safety. The power of premeditation is preparation. By rehearsing failure, we neutralize its ultimate shock value. We tell ourselves, I have already imagined the scaffold falling. I know how to breathe when it happens. This does not equate to resignation or fatalism. Rather, it is a tactical mastery over our own emotional response. It shifts the focus entirely away from what external forces can do to us and redirects it inward, asking, given this worst-case reality, how will I still act with dignity? What principles, what habits of virtue remain intact regardless of circumstance? We are practicing detachment not as emotional numbness, but as intellectual readiness. It is the quiet confidence that when everything else has been stripped away, the money, the status, the relationships, you have something immutable left, your capacity for reasoned judgment and compassionate action. This process forces us to confront the fallacy of assumed permanence. We realize that attachment itself is often the source of suffering. We crave stability in things like job security or perfect health that are defined by change. To accept that impermanence is natural, that loss, shift, and decay are built into the fabric of existence, is perhaps the deepest form of freedom. When you can calmly visualize yourself stripped down to basics, detached from all comforting illusions, a quiet strength emerges. This is where true self-mastery resides, not in predicting flawless futures, but in accepting and mastering our reaction to an inevitably flawed present. The imagined hardship becomes merely a thought experiment, a necessary mental drill to ensure that when life inevitably delivers its sharpest blow, the response will be measured, calm, and perfectly aligned with virtue. This is the ultimate act of self-sovereignty. We have traveled through the initial shockwaves of sudden anger, learning to recognize it not as a simple feeling, but as a signal. We have learned the power of the pause, slowing down time itself before reacting. We accepted that our greatest triggers often stem from rigid expectations, our internal blueprints of how life should unfold. And we practiced facing shadows, vividly imagining loss or failure so that when reality delivered its sharp blows, we were already prepared. This has been a journey into the mechanics of emotional resistance, a dismantling of reflexive reaction. The lessons gathered until now are excellent tools for self-defense, but they remain intellectual exercises performed in safety. True mastery requires applying them to history itself, to our own accumulated conflicts. If anger is merely a pattern of response, then we must become students of that pattern. We must analyze not just the moment of rage, but the entire sequence, the setup, the trigger, the ensuing outburst, and most importantly, the consequence. This brings us to the calculus of emotion. It is an accountancy exercise performed on the wreckage of our past interactions. It demands radical distance, a cold, objective examination of what transpired when we were at our fiercest. We must suspend immediate self-pity or defensive justification and ask one single, crucial question: did my reaction actually solve anything, or did it merely escalate the fire? The temptation is powerful to romanticize the outburst, to believe that ferocity proved our righteousness, or that sharpness was required to defend our boundaries. We remember those moments, the shouted words, the swift withdrawal of dignity, the furious rebuttal, and we feel a certain satisfaction in having finally stood up for ourselves. But the philosopher teaches us a different accounting. We are challenged here to treat every conflict not as an act of justice required, but as a failed hypothesis. We look back at the emotional energy expended, the sleepless nights spent brooding over slighted honor, the physical toll of maintaining sustained wrath, the sheer amount of time consumed by reliving the injustice. And we measure that expenditure against the actual return on investment. Was the peace purchased by our outburst worth the cost? This process is intensely humbling because it forces us to view ourselves from a vantage point of detached wisdom. We are no longer the subject caught in the fray. We become the scholar reviewing an artifact, viewing the drama unfold under glass. The initial resistance often comes dressed as memory. We remember how badly we were treated, and that feeling, that sting of historical wrong, can make us feel eternally justified in our continued vigilance. The calculus demands that we resist this narrative trap. It asks us to consider, what was the utility of holding onto this past pain? What practical benefit did it provide, if any, by keeping your emotional accounts permanently marked by debt? The true shift happens when we recognize that anger is rarely a force for constructive change. It is an energy, raw, hot, and incredibly inefficient. The fire of rage consumes itself, leaving behind only ash and exhaustion. And while the desire to be recognized as wronged is profoundly human, Seneca reminds us that true self-respect does not come from being understood by others. It comes from the internal integrity we maintain regardless of external perception. We start treating emotional history like data points rather than personal narratives. The sliding words become mere phonetic sounds encountered in public space. The perceived betrayal becomes an abstract variable, detached from the messy reality of human frailty. By doing this accounting, we strip the events of their unique dramatic weight and return them to a general state of indifference. Imagine reviewing a spreadsheet of your emotional life. One column might be trigger, a careless glance, a missed deadline. The second is emotional investment, the hours of rumination, the internal storming. The third is actual result, a minor argument resolved by mutual fatigue, or worse, lasting resentment that poisons future interactions. The purpose of this ledger is not to assign blame, but to establish equilibrium. To see clearly that the amount of suffering generated in our minds vastly outstrips the weight of the initial event. The misjudgment we assign to others, the thought that they intended malice when perhaps they were merely preoccupied or clumsy, is always exponentially greater than what was actually true. This intellectual distance is where freedom resides. It takes constant, disciplined practice to pull oneself back from the immediate heat of confrontation and settle into the cool rationality of examination. We move beyond simply saying, "I must not get angry." Instead, we operate under a higher principle. What is the most rational action here, based on all available data points? We learn that some conflicts cannot be won through emotional expenditure. They can only be neutralized by reasoned non-attachment. The goal shifts from correcting others' flaws or demanding restitution to minimizing our own unnecessary suffering. We are refining not merely how we respond, but what fundamental commitments we allow ourselves. Commitments built on patience, perspective, and the understanding that most external events exist simply outside of our sphere of control. Only by knowing this can we finally begin the art of truly letting go. For centuries, we have accepted a simple, dreadful notion about our emotional lives. We assume that when an event happens to us, a slight, a harsh word, a failure in our plans, the resulting anger is something outside of us. It arrives fully formed like an invading force, dictating how we must feel and act. Our initial instinct is always one of reflex: react immediately, strike back, or retreat into defensive misery. We believe that the heat rising in our chest is simply fate doing its work, a natural consequence beyond our control. But Seneca challenges this comforting illusion. He guides us to an understanding far more radical and perhaps much harder to grasp. The teachings are not about suppressing emotion entirely. They are about recognizing where true power resides. They tell us that the anger itself is not the problem, but rather the ownership we give it. The journey through self-control has been a rigorous one, identifying the initial flicker of heat, observing it as an energy signature, and creating space for that crucial pause. We learned to ask ourselves what expectations led to this discomfort, and we practiced visualizing loss so that potential pain could no longer surprise us. These were preparatory acts of resilience, designed simply to strip away the unexpected shock factor life enjoys wielding against us. But today, we arrive at a profound turning point. All these techniques, the pause, the analysis, the visualization, they build towards this single realization. That anger is not fate. It is fundamentally our choice about how we interpret an event. It is not simply something that happens to us. It is something we make happen within ourselves. The pivotal shift in philosophy is understanding agency. We are taught to move from being passive recipients of circumstance to active interpreters of those circumstances. The external trigger, the careless word, the disappointing outcome, is neutral matter. It possesses no inherent moral weight or destructive power until we affix our own interpretation to it. Until that moment of internal assent, it is merely raw data. Consider a stone dropped into a still pool. The ripple moves outward purely because the stone struck the surface, but the water itself remains undisturbed and neutral before the impact. Our life encounters are like those stones. External forces merely strike the reflective surface of our minds. What determines whether the event causes a small, manageable ripple or a catastrophic wave is not the stone's force, but the state of mind, the internal vulnerability of the water that receives it. Seneca argues forcefully that to mistake an interpretation for objective reality is the greatest source of suffering. When we interpret the slight as a deep personal attack, our emotional system overreacts dramatically. We confuse the stimulus, the word, with the judgment about the stimulus. That word means I am unworthy. This judgment creates the conviction that forces us into angry reaction. The anger is therefore not merely an emotion. It is the solidified consequence of a mistaken assumption. The task, then, becomes one of cognitive warfare, a constant reassessment of our own mental assumptions. Whenever resentment flares, we must pause and ask ourselves a series of demanding questions. What belief about myself or others am I clinging to that has been violated right now? Am I treating this situation as if it were sacred, when in fact, it is merely unscripted reality? Is my reaction focused on restoring justice, or is it simply aimed at relieving the pain of having been disappointed? This intellectual distance is where our freedom resides. It is the gap between what is happening and how we choose to define that happening. We are taught that by choosing a detached perspective, we can drain the event of its dramatic power. The offender's carelessness loses its sting when we refuse to grant it interpretive authority over our inner peace. The choice is always ours. The external world may be volatile. People will disappoint us. Circumstances will inevitably fail to meet the perfection of our internal narrative. These are facts of human existence, immutable and cold. But our response, that furious burst of indignation, that bitter withdrawal, this remains within the sovereign territory of our own will. We possess the power to refuse agreement with our initial emotional reaction. This shift is not resignation. It is profound empowerment. It means realizing that while we cannot control the triggers that bombard us throughout the day, we can achieve perfect mastery over the interpretive lens through which those triggers pass. We choose interpretation, and in that choice lies absolute self-mastery. The anger, once viewed as an uncontrollable tide of passion, transforms into a manageable expenditure of will, an energy source that we redirect towards reasoned contemplation, wisdom, and acceptance. Our freedom is the ability to say, "This has occurred. How I choose to see it and subsequently react to it remains entirely mine." We have learned that the initial spike of anger is not a command to act. It is merely energy, a signal that something feels wrong within our boundaries. We've begun to see anger less as an inherent part of who we are, and more as a guest at a party, a dramatic, demanding visitor whose presence makes us feel uncomfortable. The final challenge in this journey is not managing other people's actions. It is developing a profound relationship with our own volatile emotions. Today, we take up Seneca's ancient advice: write a letter to your anger. This seems like a small, almost literary exercise, yet it is perhaps the most potent act of self-mastery there is. Writing a letter forces us into emotional distance. We cannot simply react. Instead, we must structure our feelings into coherent prose. We must speak to it as if it were an entity outside ourselves. I imagine taking up a sheet of papyrus and addressing the script with sincerity and profound detachment. Who are you, anger? What business do you have here? You approach us often, draped in urgency and demanding instant recognition. Your tone is accusatory, whispering that injustice has occurred, that dignity must be defended right now. But when we write to you, that voice loses its power. It becomes simply words on the page, letters that can be critiqued, examined, and ultimately dismissed. I begin by acknowledging you. I see your energy. I know your force. It is powerful, raw, and undeniably convincing in the moment of high stress. But understanding a thing does not mean submitting to it. You operate on a foundational premise that something external has been violated, and only an immediate, forceful rebuttal can restore balance. You convince us that pausing means weakness or worse, complicity. We are trapped by your urgency, reacting instantly to the perceived threat. The letter becomes a conversation, one held from a place of serene intellectual superiority. I write that I understand why you feel so vital, how necessary you seem in defining our boundaries and protecting our core selves. But I must also explain something critical about true strength. It does not roar, it reasons. You ask us to confront the world with righteous fury, but what if the greatest challenge is found within ourselves? What if your loudest shouts are actually echoes of unaddressed fears or deeper insecurities about our own worthiness? When we direct that intense focus inward, examining the roots of our self-criticism and disappointment, the inner critic, we realize you are merely a highly dramatic symptom. I begin to address your specific complaints. You complain about time wasted, patience tested, or unfair treatment. I respond by asking you, what did that reaction actually accomplish? If the confrontation simply created more stress, if it damaged relationships further, or if it consumed precious energy with no lasting benefit, did we win anything? The act of writing forces this calculus. It demands that we move beyond the heat of the moment and assess the long-term cost versus the immediate release. Our anger, when examined like a poor financial investment, often proves to be one that yields only debt and regret. We are persuading you, not by force, but by reason. We show you a better life available than the cycle of flare-up and remorse. We teach you that self-control is not emotional repression. It is an active, mindful choice, the cultivated will to choose thought over impulse. I treat you like a demanding guest. When a bad guest arrives at your home, shouting insults and demands for immediate attention, the best strategy is often not to fight them off aggressively, but merely to politely talk them through their dramatic performance until they become tired and leave quietly. Your dramatic performances, the outbursts, the sharp words, the inability to wait, are exhausting. I write that we acknowledge your presence, but we are refusing to play along with the narrative you insist upon. I am choosing a different script now. This script is written by reflection, fueled by understanding, and bound by self-respect. The core message I deliver in this letter is one of gratitude for the warning sign you represent, the capacity to recognize when we are crossed, but also one of definitive limitation. I will no longer allow you to drive the chariot. The confrontation with anger thus becomes an act of defining oneself against a powerful internal force. It is learning that your identity cannot be fully swallowed by your temperament. Through this structured self-dialogue, we are not just managing feelings. We are restructuring our inner constitution. We are reclaiming the right to pause, to analyze, and to choose tranquility over turmoil. This discipline, applied daily to the constant whispers of frustration and annoyance, is how we move from merely surviving life's chaos to truly mastering it. It transforms us into deliberate authors of our own peace. We have journeyed far from the initial spark of frustration. We learn to pause, remembering that between a stimulus and our response lies the vast chasm of choice. Seneca guided us away from the belief that anger is merely an unfortunate emotion. He taught us it is fundamentally a misdirected energy. It is a powerful warning sign, yes, but a warning signal we ourselves must learn to interpret correctly. The preceding chapters forced us into uncomfortable self-examination. We questioned our rigid expectations, practicing techniques like Premeditatio Malorum, the practice of imagining the worst possible outcome, not for morbid fun, but to strip away the paralyzing shock value that fear holds over us. By visualizing loss, we found something crucial, that the core of our self remains surprisingly resilient. Then came the calculus of emotion. We learned to treat past conflicts not as searing personal narratives deserving vengeance or justification, but as objective data points for philosophical review. We asked ourselves those cold questions. Did my outburst truly solve anything? Was the drama I created worth the internal cost? This act of intellectual distancing was radical. It demanded that we step back and judge our own intensity from an external perspective. It showed us that much of the suffering we endure is a magnificent overreaction, a story we tell ourselves rather than a fact of life. The real breakthrough arrived when we grasped agency. We understood that the initial trigger, a careless word, a traffic jam, a perceived slight, is emotionally neutral until we apply the judgment to it. The event itself carries no moral weight, only our interpretation does. This realization is not just an intellectual concept. It represents an immense shift in power. We are recognizing that our inner assent, our agreement with the unfairness or pain of external events, is what truly empowers them over us. Now, we approach a profound quietude, the freedom of indifference. Seneca argues here for a wisdom that seems paradoxically anti-emotional. This does not mean becoming numb, uncaring, or withdrawing from human connection entirely. To care about nothing is merely a philosophical statement. To practice genuine indifference is to sacrifice the very self we are trying to master. The true meaning of freedom in the Stoic sense is defining where our happiness, our deepest source of peace, must reside. Can it be secured by external things, by a promotion at work, by the approval of that difficult colleague, by the fleeting admiration of friends? If we anchor our tranquility to anything outside ourselves, we build our lives upon shifting sands. The moment those external circumstances falter, the entire structure of our peace collapses with them. Our moods become hostages to the whims of chance and the flawed judgments of others. The wisdom Seneca urges us toward is a selective cultivation of indifference. It is not an absence of feeling, but a careful partitioning of what merits our emotional investment. We must learn to distinguish between things that are truly within our sphere of control, our judgments, our intentions, our measured responses, and those that are emphatically outside it. Other people's opinions, the passing verdict of society, past actions irreversible by us, or how fate unfolds tomorrow. This process is fundamentally about re-engineering our dependency map. We must deliberately peel away the layers of attachment we have built around validation and external approval. How often have we raged because a person misunderstood us, or because the world did not conform to the beautiful narrative we had written for ourselves? The freedom here is thus understood as an internal sovereignty. It means cultivating the recognition that while others are free to judge, criticize, misunderstand, or even harm us with careless words, their actions hold no inherent power over our inner state. We become like spectators in a vast theater of life, observing the drama unfold, the petty arguments, the bursts of misplaced anger, the dramas of unmet expectation, but refusing to participate in the emotional script. The disciplined indifference is not coldness. It is a fierce act of self-preservation. It is the acknowledgement that our ultimate peace must be found in the impregnable fortress of our own character. Our virtue, our ability to reason calmly when instinct screams otherwise, this is the only reliable foundation. Therefore, we do not lose our capacity for deep care. We simply redefine its targets. We dedicate our deepest concern and effort to perfecting ourselves, to strengthening our judgment, improving our self-control, and maintaining our rational composure. The rest of life's chaotic river flows around this unwavering center point. We accept the unavoidable chaos that surrounds us, acknowledging it not as a personal affront, but simply as the nature of reality itself. This acceptance is the ultimate liberation, a peace that cannot be threatened by external fortune or human failing. It is realizing that when you cease depending on anything outside yourself to make you happy, you become utterly free. We have journeyed through the complexities of emotional life. We have learned to identify anger, tracing its origin from surface irritation to deep-seated expectations. We found power in the pause, recognizing that mere seconds could create a vast distance between stimulus and response. We learned how much of our suffering is merely a story we tell ourselves about external events. By visualizing adversity or analyzing past conflicts, we began to strip those emotions of their immediate, overwhelming grip. The journey has demanded constant intellectual labor, the refusal to simply react, a monumental act of self-discipline. Now, we approach a different kind of mastery entirely, the mastery of observation. We must step back from the burning heart of the conflict and become something else entirely. We are not the participants in these human dramas. We are the quiet witnesses. The detachment is not coldness or absence. It is acute clarity. It is seeing reality as it simply is, uncolored by our immediate desires for justice, revenge, or complaint. The core lesson here is adopting the perspective of the ancient philosopher watching a vibrant marketplace, a theater teeming with life, folly, and genuine struggle. Imagine yourself standing quietly in this bustling square. Merchants hawk their goods with exuberant fervor. Children tumble through the crowds, lost in laughter. A dispute flares up near a fountain. Sharp words are exchanged, gestures fly, and frustration hangs heavy like hot dust. You see it all unfold. The shouting couple, the hasty argument over price, the burst of careless malice from one passerby to another. Yet you remain still. Your body is relaxed. Your mind is doing nothing but observing. This is not apathy. Apathy suggests that nothing matters. This observer's stance declares that nothing requires us to participate in its suffering. We are simply recognizing the patterns of human frailty, the predictable cycle of momentary passion, followed by inevitable dissipation. The observer knows that the intensity of the shouting will eventually fade. The merchant's greed will crest and recede. The little quarrel will run its course until it is forgotten amid the noise. This detached observation allows us to view our own internal conflicts with profound distance. When anger flares within you, the natural inclination is to dive into the struggle, to defend yourself, to retaliate, to prove your point. The observer, however, treats that internal heat as just another sound in the marketplace, an audible flare of momentary passion, which will pass. The wisdom gained from this detached stance is the recognition that most things we deem catastrophic are simply unscripted moments. We are so invested in a narrative, a perfect outcome, a guaranteed response, a sense of deserved respect, that when reality fails to meet this deeply personal script, we treat it as an attack on our very self-worth. The observer gently questions the necessity of that script itself. Consider the people around you, caught up in their small tragedies and petty triumphs. They live within their own highly individualized inner theaters. One person's profound embarrassment is another's cruel delight. One man's outburst over spilled wine might be viewed by a neutral eye as merely poor spatial coordination. By widening our perspective until it encompasses the entire marketplace, we realize that most dramatic emotions are fundamentally tiny, small bursts of energy against the vast backdrop of enduring life. They are fleeting and insignificant outside of the emotional context in which they occur. The discipline required for this is intense: to watch without judgment, to witness a perceived injustice or a shocking act of carelessness, and simply note it, labeling it internally as an action, rather than allowing it to be labeled immediately as a moral failing or a personal insult. We observe the energy that propelled the action, but we refuse to internalize the weight of the judgment. This simple refusal is the cornerstone of true freedom. We are learning to find our center point not by building defenses against external storms, but by recognizing that the storms themselves, the anger, the shock, the disappointment, are temporary meteorological events in the grand history of your life. They pass. We merely observe their passing. This observer is immune to the emotional blackmail of immediate feeling. He has seen the whole cycle before: the rising tension, the peak of fury, the exhausted deflation. This internal self becomes a steady point of gravity amidst a swirling chaos. It requires continually asking oneself, what is the essential truth here? Strip away the assumptions. Remove the expectation of perfection from this encounter. If I treat this conflict merely as data, a pattern of human interaction, rather than an assault on my character, what remains? Only the observable facts, and those facts, upon closer inspection, rarely carry the destructive power we imagine them to possess. The detached observer steps out of the performance entirely, realizing that participation was voluntary and withdrawal is always available. This self-possession allows us not only to endure the cruelty of others, but to engage with them from a position of genuine strength, a strength rooted not in resistance or retaliation, but in unshakable calm. It is the ultimate realization that, while we cannot control what happens around us, nor can we dictate the behavior of others, we retain absolute and inviolable sovereignty over the space between the event and our response. We are merely standing back, allowing the drama to play out, knowing fully well that our peace resides within this unimpeachable sanctuary of pure observation. We have walked through grand philosophical concepts. We have explored the nature of anger as a physical energy, analyzed expectation, and learned to confront our own fury through letters and detachment. But true wisdom does not arrive in single, dramatic breakthroughs. It is not found only when facing great betrayals or deep loss. The profound shifts we seek are far more subtle. They happen in the mundane theater of daily life, in the traffic jam, in the delayed coffee, in the careless word whispered across a dinner table during a normal evening meal. We must fundamentally change our focus from the massive, catastrophic moments to the micro moments of everyday existence. These small instances are where the true battle for self-mastery is won or lost. For so long, we have been taught to wait for the great crisis, the monumental disaster, or the unbearable insult that will finally teach us how to be free. We prepare our minds with vivid mental rehearsals of loss and failure, treating adversity as some far-off villain we must face in a dramatic finale. But the truth, illuminated by years of reflection, is subtler and much more immediate. The great philosophical lesson Seneca showed us is that freedom does not reside solely in mastering the cataclysm. It is found instead in navigating the messy, unpredictable tapestry of ordinary existence. Life is not an opera written with perfectly structured acts. Rather, it is a vast collection of unscripted moments, moments of delayed transport, missed connections, unexpected miscommunications. These are the chapters that have no pre-written ending, and they often feel far more challenging than any imagined trial. The difficulty begins when we mistake randomness for pattern, or imperfection for failure. We enter a moment expecting a certain rhythm to hold true, that our friend will remember the detail, that the meeting will progress smoothly, that the world will adhere to the comforting structure of our internal script. When reality deviates from this expectation, a profound sense of distress emerges. This upset is often incorrectly interpreted as an external injustice done to us, when in fact, it is merely the collision between fragile anticipation and indifferent reality. Think of life's unscripted chapters not as places where things go wrong, but as training grounds for radical acceptance. They are moments where we must learn that our peace cannot be held hostage by circumstance. We struggle to accept the inconvenience, the tardiness, or the simple lack of effort displayed by another person. These small failures, a delayed coffee cup, a frustrating bureaucratic delay, feel exponentially larger than their objective weight because we have attached too much emotional significance to their punctual execution. The wise philosopher begins to see these daily irritations differently. They stop being personal attacks or signs of chaos. They become simply data points, neutral observations about how the world is at this moment. This shift is profound. It means removing our intense, subjective judgments and replacing them with a clear recognition. This is what happened. There was no malice required, only entropy. To live fully within these unscripted chapters requires an active effort of emotional surrender. We must practice forgiving ourselves the inability to control the narrative flow. The sheer volume of variables in human life, other people's moods, unpredictable weather, sudden shifts in global affairs, is simply too much for any single will to contain. Trying to enforce a perfect script upon reality is not merely futile. It is the root source of our constant disappointment and frustration. This realization leads us to an embracing of imperfection itself. We are taught that perfection is an artifact of fiction, a polished ideal we construct to keep ourselves feeling safe. Yet, life's truth is its glorious messiness. Our greatest gains in emotional resilience come when we can genuinely accept the good enough, accepting that others will inevitably fail us in small ways, accepting that plans will collapse under the weight of unexpected reality, accepting that sometimes nothing will happen at all. This acceptance is not resignation, but profound intellectual liberation. We begin to view ourselves and our fellow man through a lens of necessary fallibility. We acknowledge that every person we encounter is running their own imperfect script, written with incomplete knowledge and deeply personal vulnerabilities. When someone acts poorly or fails us, our impulse is often to react defensively, to assign blame, to demand accountability for the deviation from our expectation. But emotional maturity requires restraint in judgment. The true art of living fully in these unscripted chapters lies in developing what we might call compassionate indifference. This does not mean becoming cold or heartless, Rather, it means prioritizing your own internal tranquility above your desperate need for external order. It is recognizing that while you have the absolute power over how you respond, you have no legitimate claim on how life must unfold for you to be content. That control belongs only to reality itself. When we consistently apply this principle, when a delay occurs, and instead of spiraling into frustration, we simply observe the state of being delayed. When someone speaks carelessly, and instead of retaliating, we merely notice the words passing like sounds in the wind, we are doing more than surviving. We are building an inviolable inner sanctuary. This sanctuary is our mind, a place that remains calm, composed, and unshaken, regardless of the storm or the unexpected joy raging around us. This constant practice of observation, this unwavering commitment to viewing life as merely unfolding, moment by messy moment, strips away the false weight of anticipation. We learn that the true source of anxiety is not the unscripted moment itself, but our frantic internal insistence that everything must follow a predictable pattern for us to be worthy or safe. By letting go of those rigid structures, of needing things to make sense, or people to behave perfectly, we finally tap into the deepest source of tranquility, the acceptance of what is. The mastery we seek is not over the world, it is merely within ourselves. It is the quiet wisdom that allows us to sit in a chaotic moment and simply say, "This chapter is unscripted, and for now, I will observe it without judgment." This detached observation is not apathy, it is pure presence, the highest form of emotional sovereignty. We have traveled through the architecture of anger. We learn to recognize it not as a permanent state, but as an energy, a sharp warning signal that we must first observe. We understood that true power lies in the pause, that between the trigger and the response is the quiet space where self-mastery resides. Throughout our studies of Stoicism, we have gradually untied ourselves from the rigid cords of expectation. We learn to embrace the unscripted nature of reality, finding peace not in perfect outcomes, but in radical acceptance. We saw how much suffering stemmed simply from believing that life owed us a predictable script. Yet the journey does not end with mere observation. To observe is vital, but it can sometimes feel cold, a quiet resignation that risks becoming apathy. The final lesson requires something deeper, a movement beyond detachment toward active grace. It asks us to let go. Letting go suggests abandonment. We might think of abandoning our rights, our expectations, or even the people who caused us pain. But Seneca teaches us that true letting go is not about diminished regard for ourselves. It is profoundly an act of self-reclamation. It is recognizing that holding onto bitterness, that tight, painful grip on past wrongs, is like carrying a heavy stone. The weight does not belong to you. The emotional burden belongs to those who wronged you, and yet, by refusing to release it, we choose to wear it ourselves. The gentle art of letting go is therefore an act of profound self-care. It is choosing your own peace over righteous indignation. It asks us to shift our focus from punitive justice, from demanding that the other person feel the consequence of their actions, to personal freedom. Forgiveness, in this context, ceases to be a moral obligation owed to the offender and becomes, instead, a sacred transaction with oneself. Consider the raw energy of resentment. It is sticky, viscous emotion that coats the edges of our spirit. We build narratives around old hurts. This time they slighted me. Those words deeply wounded me. I was cheated by their carelessness. These stories are real to us, acutely painful and vivid. But Seneca asks us to pause and look at these narratives with cool distance. Are these stories serving you? Do they make you lighter or heavier? The initial instinct is to categorize the offense and hold the grudge like evidence in a court case, proof of our pain. We want acknowledgement. We demand that the scale of their action match the depth of our internal suffering. But this pursuit of balance is exhausting, futile even. The person who hurt us rarely possesses the self-awareness or capacity for perfect accountability that our inner critic demands. The choice we face is whether to continue feeding the injustice, to keep reliving the moment of offense, like a wound continually picked at by nosy fingers. Or can we simply turn away from the retelling? Can we acknowledge the hurt without letting it dictate our future mood or choices? This requires moving beyond mere understanding and into practice. It is the daily choice to release the story. Forgiveness, then, becomes a gentle but resolute act of severing an emotional lifeline, a connection that only serves to pull us back toward the drama of yesterday's slight. It is not about excusing their behavior or minimizing your pain. You are allowed to feel hurt. You are allowed to acknowledge the reality of the wound. But by releasing the need for them to suffer, or even just the need to admit their fault, we free up a colossal amount of mental and emotional energy. That reclaimed power can be directed inward, towards building virtue, towards self-improvement, towards living more fully in the present moment. The journey toward letting go is not linear. It is characterized by moments of near success followed by inevitable relapse. There will be days when an old trigger activates the entire chain reaction. The heat returns to the chest. The bitterness rises like bile. In those moments, we must remember our accumulated wisdom. We do not need a perfect breakthrough. We just need a return to the fundamental practice. Pause. Observe. Breathe. We remind ourselves that self-mastery is found in recognizing that while others have the freedom to act foolishly, we retain absolute authority over how we internally categorize and consequently respond to those actions. Our inner sanctuary remains inviolable. External chaos cannot breach its walls if we simply refuse to grant it emotional residency. The wisdom gained here suggests that the most radical form of self-love is realizing that some burdens are not meant for us to carry. Some grievances belong to the air, to the moment, to the distance between people. Our highest calling is to be light enough to carry only what nourishes us, our own character, our own reasoned contemplation, and the quiet assurance of a soul finally at peace with its own inner sovereignty. To let go, then, is to choose oneself decisively and gently in every breath. It is choosing grace over grievance and finding enduring freedom not by controlling what happens